All right, let's tackle some good game related loop list tasks here. The only difference is we're going to use the list that Gamemaker makes, which is the list of objects that it keeps track of, instead of using our own DS list that you guys make from scratch. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get this tower here, the close tower, to figure out which one is the closest and fire at it. Now, I'm not going to use the built-in Gamemaker script called instance nearest, because what I want to show you how to do is how do you find the nearest instance by going through the list of monsters on the screen. That way, anytime you need to do something similar, you know the basic logic behind it, and you're not limited to just the scripts that Gamemaker provides you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to make this a script. It's called fire at closest, and this is going to have two jobs here. It's actually going to find the closest and then fire at it. So let's just jump into there. Now keep in mind what we have on the screen. In our room, we have a couple monsters, and you have to remember they all have an ID number, right? And then we have our close tower. What I'm going to do as a little logic here is I'm basically going to find out how many monsters are on the screen, and I'm going to use a loop to cycle through them. And every time I'm going to find out how far away that individual monster is. Every time I find a monster that is the new closest monster to me, I'm going to remember that monster's ID, and I'm going to remember that monster's distance. This is very similar to the routine we did in the last lesson of finding the minimum value in the list. Okay, but this time I'm going to do it with Gamemaker's list, and I'm going to do it with monsters and their IDs. So let's get to it. So first thing I'm going to do here is make this window a little bigger, and a smart thing to do right at the beginning is find out how many monsters I have. So I'm going to say num is instance number of monster. I'm going to say if the number is 0, I'm just going to get out of here, right? Because there's no point in finding the nearest when there's no monsters. Now that you know you have at least one monster in the list, what I have to do is I'm going to make a variable here just to keep track of the ID of the closest monster. And so I'm going to call this one, let's call it close ID. And I'm going to set it to the first monster in Gamemaker's list of monsters. And that script from way back was instance find. So remember, I'm already using a list Gamemaker has made and keeping track of. So I'm going to say instance find, and I want monster number 0. Okay, I'm going to assume that monster 0 is the closest monster to me for now, and then I'm going to cycle through the list. Now I'm going to make another variable here called close distance. This is going to be the distance from me to that monster. And for now, I'm just going to go point distance, and I'm going to say from my x and y coordinate. Remember, this is a script that the tower is going to be using. So from my x and y to close IDs x and close IDs y. So remember, you can do this with the IDs of objects, right? You can use and access their variables. So now I know two things, right? The ID of the closest monster, and I know the distance of the closest monster. Okay, assuming it's monster 0. Now let's go and run our loop. And I want to go through each monster from monster, basically the beginning if I want. And I want to go to the last monster, constantly asking, how far away are you? And if you're closer, I'm going to use them as my closest ID, and remember their closest distance. When the loop is finished, I should have the closest ID and the closest distance of all the monsters. So a little loop here. Now, I could start at 0 and say go through all the monsters, but one nice thing here to remember is I've already grabbed monster 0 out. So really going and pulling monster 0 out again isn't needed because I've already got their ID and I already have their distance. So I'm going to start the loop at 1. Okay, I'm going to skip past monster 0. Now I'm going to go less than num, k equals k plus 1. Now what am I going to do? I'm going to grab out the closest monster. So monster ID equals instance find, And out of the monster list, I'd like to grab monster K. So remember, the first time the loop runs, I'm grabbing monster 1. The next time, monster 2. The next time, monster 3, right? And it goes to the end. Now I want to find the distance, how far away this monster is. So I'm going to do something similar again. Point distance, x comma y. That monster I pulled out's x. That monster I just pulled out y. Now I got the distance. Now I get to ask a question. Is this a new, closer monster than the one I'm remembering? So, if the distance I just found is less than the closest distance I'm remembering, which I had assumed was from monster 0, then I have a new winner in the closest monster race here. And I'll set my closest distance to equal that distance, and I'm going to remember that the closest ID is the ID of this monster. Now, what's the ID of this monster? MID, right? That's what you pulled out with instance find, pulling out those IDs. So, that's really it. And that loop just cycles through. Every time it finds one closer, it's going to remember the distance and the ID of the closest monster. Now that's really it. That's the part of the routine that finds the closest ID. So when you get here, close ID has the ID of the closest monster. Okay? Has to. Now we want to fire. So firing should be a simple task here. Let's just find the direction of that monster. So I'll say direction is point direction. Let's go from my XY and go to close ID's X and the closest monster's ID Y. And now let's just make an arrow and fire it that way. So let's just call the arrow whatever here, ABC, instance create. And let's create X comma Y, O arrow, and ABC speed is 8. Now let's make it a little faster. ABC's direction is that DIR, right, that I just solved here. And ABC's image angle should also equal DIR. And that's really it. Now I have a red line here. I'm just trying to see what I might have done wrong. We'll give it a go. I'll figure out the error afterwards. But this should be good to go. Now I noticed that at the end of these lines with VAR for the local variables, I notice when I put a semicolon, those errors disappear. I'll just leave the semicolon there even though it's not needed. So you'll see here my script to fire it closest. Let's actually try it out. So my close tower, you'll see it's already set up here in the file. In the step event, I already call fire it closest every 15 steps. So let's just see if this is actually going to work. And there it goes, firing at the closest. And when that one runs out of life, here let's create a few more with the C key. And you'll see here it seems to work. It finds the next one, hammers away at it. This is a great little one to do for tower defense type games, right? Where your towers have to detect the closest enemy or farthest. But the nice thing is that routine, even though you could have just replaced this whole thing with an instance nearest script already written in Gamemaker, this one's great because you can apply this logic for really all types of code. So it's nice to know what it's doing behind the scenes. But that basically right there is something close to what Gamemaker's doing when it goes instance nearest. Anyways, thanks for watching. Hope that helps you. And there you go. You got some fire at closest.